Hello? Right. Right, horror, but first chocolate. I'm just going to do a little thing. Right, this is probably a little too quiet, and this is probably overly booming and loud. Yep, right, in the middle. Okay, horror. Horror, then followed horror, chocolate, and then some other stuff. So, as a kid, I had quite a bad stutter. And my mum, being my mum, made me into speech competitions, because this is what mothers do. And as a great mother would do, she would shamelessly bribe me. I got a Chewbacca toy out of doing a talk once, which was absolutely wonderful. But much more often, it was something involving chocolate. Now, yesterday, in a room about 30 feet that way, I had a summer roll, which is an element of my childhood that I'd missed a great deal. I ate that summer roll at the end of the talk. It was disgusting. Childhood is not what we think it was. So I have gone the other way pretty much entirely for this. This is something called a Queen Anne chocolate raspberry fish. I think it's quite generic, but the whole point is I have not had chocolate or raspberry or marshmallow for about 72 hours at this point. So if I make it through this talk and I do not collapse from need of chocolate before that, at the very end, I'm going to raise this up, I'm going to tear the thing off, and I'm going to eat it in front of you. And if you wouldn't mind, as I do that, if you could burst into outrageous applause and cheering for the simple fact of a man enjoying sugar. Do we have a deal? Yeah. Brilliant. I love it. Thank you very much. Right. So, I'd like to take us on a journey today. This started out originally, this was going to be all about horror and indie movies, because there's a really interesting pipeline going on there, which I think is quite relevant to us as an industry. But then I started taking the theme of the conference more seriously. As I understand it, the theme of this conference is evolution, the evolution of games, evolution of the games industry. And so what I propose to do is to get us all into a little life raft together and to go on a little bit of a navigator's journey. We're going to start off talking about film and the kind of indie horror game to indie film pipeline. We're then going to take a left turn, and then we're going to really take another turn. And we're going to end up in a completely different place where we talk about some mad stuff that may make no sense. My goal on this journey is to entertain you, hopefully to inform you a little bit, and to have you walking away saying, if nothing else, this was the most bonkers talk that I engaged in at NZGDC. So I welcome you into this mad little raft, if you don't mind. Are you ready to paddle a little bit with me? I will take your largely silent nods as complete assent. Love it. Thank you. So, a little bit about me. I have quite a varied background. Creatively, I have worked in film, game, TV, and agency development. What I do mostly nowadays is I actually work with tech startups. And there's a really interesting phase that I love, which is that phase where you've got people who have a really awesome idea and great capability, and you're trying to get from there to like having money and doing stuff. And that's an interesting, unique, wild ride every time, and I really enjoy that. So that's kind of the space I live in these days. I've mentioned this before, I dislike all the terminology around this stuff, but I'm quite weird. You have possibly already noticed this. And so my brain kind of tends to intersect at a little bit of an angle, and this is actually going to be part of our talk later on. So hence also the quite appropriate little picture there. And today, as I said, our raft that we're on, I actually did a talk last year here as well, which focused very heavily on this kind of indie horror pipeline. And I just want to give a kind of update on that. Some interesting stuff has happened that's quite relevant to us. I want to give you a little update on me, wildly narcissistic, but also actually kind of applicable to what we're talking about. And then we start to go into interesting territory. We have a literary reference, we have a bigger universe, and we have the word navigation. And as this unfolds, I hope this makes a little more sense. A couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health in this talk. I hope not in any particularly confrontational or triggering way. I just want to flag that for you. I'm also going to talk a little bit about AI. Not, I should emphasize, in the context of people losing their jobs in the games industry or people deciding that tapping things into Midjourney is the equivalent of an entire art pipeline. That is not the purpose of this at all. And later on in the talk, for quite specific reasons, there's going to be some bits of AI art. I find, especially at the moment, it's just polite to kind of tell people where you're coming from, what you're going to do, so there's no surprises there. So, recently, There's been a large trend over the past few years where the wonderful film people, who genuinely are wonderful but often live in kind of a different world, they have begun to discover indie horror games. This is a bad screenshot from the game Iron Lung, which is by David Zemansky. It is a terrifying low-poly adventure where you are trapped inside a submarine with no windows and something is out there. It's a great game. This was optioned on a film deal last year, and as I understand it, is kind of proceeding through to production. This is super exciting because it's not, a lot of the recent pattern has always been, you get a sort of big franchise, you get your Assassin's Creed, and then the big Hollywood money tries to sort of turn that into the Assassin's Creed movie. Much more interesting to me is the idea that there are all these delicious, weird, messy horror games out there that exist on a very different scale. And people are getting really interested in taking that and making it into a small, messy, weird horror movie. And this is super cool. So a lot of deals in this space have started to come through over the last year, including hometown favorite, which I think everyone knows about. But there is potentially a Dredge movie in the pipeline. And I'm fascinated by this. This is going to be great. How do you turn that into a movie? What does it look like? Generally awesome signs. Why is this happening? There's some really interesting business dynamics that apply to games and film that have become very apparent over the past kind of 2 or 3 years. The first, which is always a good thing, and this is always a benefit of horror generally, if you take a horror idea and you don't spend, by Hollywood standards, you do not spend that much money on it, but you give the audience the thing that they are expecting, you can do very well. I have several young people in my life for whom Five Nights at Freddy's is the greatest thing in the history of the world. They went to this film and they said, that was Five Nights at Freddy's. This is exactly what we want. And reviews were mixed. We can ignore that because most of the reviewers did not know what they were in for. So from a kind of Hollywood filmmaking perspective, I plonked down essentially $20 million to make this thing. It gave me much more money back, and the core of it was that thing that we were expecting, we made. Remarkably simple when you talk about it this way. However, you may also have spotted the reverse. And not in any sense to attack any filmmakers or people who worked very hard on making a movie, but I think you could quite clearly argue, and I'm sort of tangentially connected to people who were involved in some of the deal making with this, so I have some sort of perspective. This is what happens in the old style when Hollywood, the film people who know best, say, oh, thank you, that little video game that you have seems to be popular, we will take it now and we will make a great film from it. And pat, thank you very much, there is your money. I think it's reasonable to say, if you have seen the film, that it is not recognizable as a Borderlands film. If you play the games, which I have, and you go see that movie, there is a very tangential at best connection between the two. There are a lot of dynamics involved in that. My understanding is that most of the reason for the budget is literally on the poster. And there is a thing of when you, as a filmmaker, if you get large stars who are interested in your film, this is really good news, and you will instantly pivot to arranging all of your plans around the fact that those stars are interested. At which point, a movie that might have been a much lower budget suddenly becomes a much higher budget, and the whole game changes. There is, I think, a reasonable argument that somewhere in a different universe, there was a Borderlands movie that cost a little bit more than Five Nights at Freddy's, but not much, perhaps $30 million. And that movie would probably not have had major stars in it. And that movie would probably have been quite grungy and lo-fi and quite interesting. And either that movie would have failed as well, at which point we only lost $30 million, or it would have become a kind of minor cult hit. And it would have made back its money, perhaps been quite successful. And if that happens, then we make another one with a slightly larger budget, and another one, and we've learned how to make a Borderlands movie. But that did not happen. Meanwhile, waiting in the wings, there are multiple wonderful 80s VHS horror, lo-fi, bad video store type video games, which are awesome. The low poly ones, the ones that are $5 on Steam, waiting in the wings, being optioned in the pipeline and potentially being made. I would also add here and now, strong recommendation, the game Mouthwashing, which came out, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. It is a low-poly horror horror game set in space. It is very affordable. It is on Steam. It is perverse in all of the best ways. And when you're playing it, you're like, I'd love to see that as a movie. So there is an interesting pipeline coming through there. But this is what is happening, and I think this is what I think most of us, especially in games, but also in film, have been observing over the past little while. There is a foundational resource crunch happening, which is that large games and large movies are costing too much and in some cases taking too long to make. And from a purely financial mechanics perspective, they are not worth that investment on the whole. And you have a whole lot of weird dynamics in there. You have all of the Disney stuff. You have on the game side the live service aspect. But one way or another, these things are too big and they are too costly. And that creates a foundational problem. Sean Layden, who was the former head of PlayStation, made some really interesting remarks on this over the past few days. The same thing. He's basically, if you think of there being different sort of quantum levels of budget and return, you're kind of 5 million, 30 million, 50 million, 100 million, 500 million. Some of those work really well and some of them don't. And we've all seen large issues with largely hyped games recently. And partly as a result, we are also obviously all seeing that our friends are basically losing their jobs. Enter into this briefly what executives tend to call AI, which I think at the moment in that sense is basically code for this pipeline that currently needs all those quite expensive people. We can reduce that pipeline and make it faster and cheaper. My take, and you may have a different take, purely financially, I think we are seeing there's a giant business cycle hangover from the zero interest rates of the last 10 years. There's also the thing that COVID kind of pushed about 10 years worth of business cycle into about 3 years. And then the third factor I strongly suspect is that as people do their forward planning and they are betting on the improvement of AI tools and the integration into the pipeline, they are saying that thing that we used to need 10 people for, we can now do with 3 people. And I suspect that is the very difficult reality of what those calculations are. I do not offer a position on that, and I'm certainly not sympathizing with that. I am very sympathetic to the effects in games and film that are playing out in this. Because there are starting to be successful screen adaptations from games, you are seeing the start of savior complex, which is very real and very dangerous, especially when it comes to film. When you have A Last of Us come through, when you have Five Nights at Freddy's, Hollywood being an essentially imitative business, everyone then goes, I got to go get me a game. And then you have things like Borderlands happening, which is everyone went and got a game, and they didn't necessarily think about it in terms of making a high quality adaptation. And so the savior that games is going to be, just like the savior that comics was going to be 15 years ago, gets played out and gets everyone into trouble. Horror is an interesting dynamic, especially because as a genre in both film and game, it's almost the only one where budget does not strongly correlate to return. And what I mean by that is, Five Nights at Freddy's, for instance, say they had spent $50 million on Five Nights at Freddy's instead of $20 million. Would it have done any better? I would argue not. Whereas for very large films, there is perceived to be a correlation of, if you want to do a really big Marvel movie, you have to start at $200 million. But horror is weird, where the really breakout horror hits are often just microscopically cheap, and they have this huge return. And in the reverse, you can spend a lot of money on something in horror and just get nowhere. So it's in this weird, interesting space, which I would argue is an advantage for horror. Because again, I think both those industries have to try and get away from the fantasy of we want to keep spending $100 million on things. There are pockets of value to be created if we can figure out how to do the awesome $500,000 horror game that then ultimately, if it's successful, gets made into a $5 million movie, and the whole package returns something that is quite a lot more than that. And this is different from if you basically multiply each of those by 10 or 100, which is what people are trying to do. So this is my very brief, this was going to be the whole talk. I wanted to give a sort of update on things that are happening in horror and indie film because they're interesting and they're directly relevant to what I said last year. Now, if you'll excuse me for a moment, we enter the narcissistic section of this talk. It is relevant, I promise. This is me. This is nearly 1 year ago. I am on the deck of the Hikatea, which as we speak is about 800 meters that way, which is a beloved crane ship from the early 1900s that was floated out to New Zealand and has rested at that harbour mostly ever since. The Hikatea is staffed by a wonderful volunteer crew whose average age is somewhere north of 80. They are awesome. You have never lived until you have sat with people who have worked on ships their entire lives. They're amazing. The reason I'm doing this is I was volunteering last year on the Hikatea, and you may or may not be able to see it, but certainly on the inside, my face is quite distorted. And part of the reason for this is that at this point, I had probably an average of 1 hour's sleep for the last 6 weeks. And I had not eaten properly in probably about that time as well. So what happened to me last year, for a whole bunch of personal reasons that we don't need to go into, I experienced a pretty strong personal, emotional, physiological crisis. And I'm a human being. I've been through ups and downs in my life before, of course, but this was far more severe. And I would strongly argue that I lost some contact with reality for a while. And I was desperately searching for just things to do, things to take my mind off things, ways to find sleep. One of those ways was to volunteer in the Hikatea, which was really fun. But even in this photo, I actually remember this photo being taken. And I was literally like, I'm not sure I can stand up right now. I developed a really interesting thing, which I don't recommend, which is reactive hypoglycemia, which is a reaction that the body can have to extreme stress. It's basically like getting really bad diabetes temporarily. And so for quite a while, about 4 months of last year, I had to eat every 3 hours and all through the night. And if I wasn't going to do that, I would faint. And I've always been a person like, perhaps aside from appearances, I don't actually eat that much. And I certainly don't like eating every 3 hours a day. So it was this challenging, weird, all-in ordeal. Again, I don't recommend it. But one thing that became really clear to me as an experience was it really felt like territory. And I think many of us feel this in general. When we are out of sorts, if we are anxious or depressed or if something else is going on, all the metaphors and the things we use to talk about these things, they're often about it as a place. The weather has rolled in. You're trying to navigate some territory, trying to find your way through a depressive episode or something like that. We think of it as almost like a place that we go in this really difficult space that we try to navigate. And when I talk to people about this, people often say, yes, that is literally how I think of it. It's a place that we go. And about 700 years ago, it was a place where the Italian poet Dante Alighieri also went. He wrote a large poem called The Divine Comedy, the Divina Commedia, of which the first part is the most famous. It is the Inferno. And at the very start of the Inferno, and this is an illustration from that, Dante says that he's about halfway through his life and he finds himself wandering in a dark wood. That's what the Selva Oscura is. It's a dark wood. And everything seems to be collapsing around him. He's lost purpose. He feels like he is pursued by animals. He is in a very bad state. And what Dante does is he actually enters into the realms of hell from this. And he is guided by an ancient Roman poet called Virgil, who is surprisingly similar to like Alex from Half-Life 2, but it's basically like the companion character who guides him through hell. And Dante literally creates this incredibly complex structure. He divides hell into moats and levels and layers, and it's all really beautifully constructed. And as he journeys through it with Virgil, of course, by coincidence, he meets a lot of the people that he knew in his life, mostly enemies of his from Florence. And he takes this kind of great glee. He's like, oh, hello, person who was mean to me. I see that you are stuck upside down in boiling mud. How ironic. But it's a really interesting thing because it is Dante navigating this spiritual and emotional crisis that he's going to, and he is moving through territory. And there was a game made of Dante's Inferno. I don't know if anyone played it. It was an Xbox 360 game. Being fair, it kind of missed the point, but it was an interesting attempt. So just again, I'm sort of weaving out threads here, and then we're going to go into a mad rush on our life raft of bringing these things together. So one of the things that I started thinking about when I was approaching this talk and the theme of the conference, the evolution of games, the evolution of how we approach things, is this idea of, as game developers, we deal with computers and computation inherently. And we are in an age where AI is beginning to play a very assertive role in that. And I need to emphasize for what I'm about to say over the next few minutes, I am so far away from an AI scientist or engineer or a math expert. But in my work, I have access to people who are those things. And some of the kind of dark, weird depths of the math and things around AI is extremely interesting and exotic and weird. And one of the most compelling things that most people who work on it will tell you, almost like with all maths and most physics, it genuinely feels like you are discovering something that is already there. That math is not something that exists just in the kind of squishy matter of our brains, but that you are uncovering something external. And at the same time, there is another realm which has a great deal of historical relevance, which is the place that, rightly or wrongly, I felt I was in, and that Dante felt he was in, and I think we all do at times, which is the realm of the imaginal. And I would define this as literally what happens when we close our eyes. Where do we go? Where do we go when we dream? Where do we go when we all play Halo together? And it's kind of a trivial question because, everyone basically knows that these are neurons firing in our brains and that's just what's happening. But at the same time, there's a really interesting question to me of what if you choose to take seriously the idea that there is a place that we go that is potentially beyond our own minds, which is a realm of the imagination. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the long history that people have of trying to actually explore both those ideas. These are both ideas that people have taken quite seriously in various ways at various times. So, arguably, around about the start of the 19th century, a whole bunch of things started happening where people started to think of information itself as an explorable space. Obviously, there was mathematics before this. Obviously, you have things like Newton. But you have a series of discoveries that have gone through to today which have explored and built out these really interesting structures. I'm always interested with Boolean algebra because it's, if you read some of the papers around that, it's actually really interesting. He's very consciously arguing for it as this explorable space. But then the Dewey Decimal System, our friend from our childhood libraries, I mean, it's someone treating information as literally a physical construct that you can map inside a library using numbers. There were various advances in stats, especially, higher dimensional spaces, which gets really interesting. And then around the turn of the 20th century, you have the large introduction of quantum as an idea. And without me embarrassing myself by getting this wrong and not being a physicist, if there's one thing about that kind of defines quantum math, it's basically probabilities. You've got a whole lot of things that can be in one place or another, and you can't pick any particular thing, but as a broad matter of statistics, you can start to find your way into making predictions about things that should be unpredictable, which is weird and interesting. This comes to a head with a whole bunch of people, not just these ones, taking from the 1930s through to the early 1950s, where the foundations of the computers that we use are built. There's a specific set of brutal calculations around modern deterministic computing. You probably have heard of von Neumann and Turing. There are a bunch of other people as well, but there's a mathematical basis for this is what all those logic gates add up to in our computers. And then cycling back, people had banged their head against the dream of AI for a very long time. There have been multiple waves of AI working, then not working, then all these things. And I think some of you know in 2018, there was a breakthrough paper that established a new architecture for essentially neural models and transformers. And the interesting thing, and what I'm talking about with people exploring things, is actually at the very weird edges of how those AI models work. If you keep on pushing it, it cycles background to physics and to how you deal with heat and thermodynamics, which cycles background to essentially quantum stuff that Einstein was looking at about 120 years ago. This is why people get so compelled about the idea of information as a space that we deal with. We do computation all the time. When you are looking at the math, it all kind of connects in a very esoteric way. Not to get too LSD on you, but at the deep reaches of some of the AI math, you basically have incredibly exotic, higher dimensional geometries all circling and intersecting and trying to join up in these beautifully kind of faceted jewels. It is crazy as shit, and also really cool. So, broadly speaking, attempts to explore and perhaps construct this idea of an informational realm, a space that is actually outside our brains, that can nonetheless be navigated, be constructed, be used. Coming from the complete other idea, when we close our eyes, when we step into our dreams, when we talk to each other, when we imagine things, is there an external space that we are accessing here? And this could be 20 slides. Many people that we would see as scientists or not have all basically dealt with this challenge. Plato asked the first question of basically, are there things out there beyond our brains that are like the idealized versions of what we think of? And then it goes from there. Again, there's this flourishing in the 19th century and early 20th century. It's this kind of ferment of interesting ideas. And Jung, I think, is the one where Jung really poses a question of, aside from the dreams and thoughts and hopes that we have as individual people, is there kind of like a shared basement? Is there a collective unconscious, subconscious layer? And what a lot of these end up doing is they end up arguing for that there are some kind of shared spaces in our unconscious. And the symbolic part is simply that we tend to interact with them through symbols. Again, my bad way of thinking about this is essentially Master Chief in a Halo game is a kind of projection forward of something. So, having gone through the weird and strange history, now we're going to start tying these things together. So the thing about these realms, and by the way, you in no way have to accept or believe that these are actually external places. There are long, wonderfully nerdy conversations that we can have late into the night about whether it literally is all in our heads. If there's something else out there, that is absolutely fine. But foundationally, both of these realms, as we experience them, are interactive. We move in dreams. We sometimes experience lucid dreams where we wake up and we realize that we're dreaming, but we're still dreaming, and we can influence and control them to some extent. Information, again, the entire industry that we all work in is literally at one level about consciously manipulating and exploring and creating things in the information realm and then projecting them into the human imaginal realm. And I'd like to propose briefly, all of this is wonderful as conjecture. People have taken a lot of drugs and tried to explore these areas. That's great. There's a really interesting thing that there's a path emerging where we could test these ideas over the next kind of 10 years. And this largely comes from the idea that we are starting to stick wires into people's brains and to measure things and to get much better output of what is actually going on. Some of you will have seen Neuralink. That's a sort of set of fibers that's been put into two people's brains. It's very low bandwidth. My understanding is it's about 100 bits per second, which is, a really, really bad, like mid-1980s modem. But the resolution at which we can image brains is getting higher. And at some point, we will be able to actually watch the neurons zipping around inside the brain and doing all their thing. And we will be able to go, okay, that seems to be what is going on inside a brain. There are a bunch of theories, brain-to-brain communication, for instance, where if this advances to the idea that we can hook things up together, we will be able to monitor what is happening when two people communicate and what their brains are doing. We'll be able to compare if two people are playing a video game. what are they experiencing versus what the game is outputting, and you'll be able to compare. The interesting thing for this for me, and this is the kind of science fiction leap, and I'm quite unapologetic about this, there'll be a really interesting point if we can find things that the information realm, especially the AI, but that the computer cannot see that our brains can. Another way to put this is there something that humans can experience that's more than just a lot of computation going on inside a brain? Because the kind of AI hardliners will say that ultimately you can probably reduce all of this into a very sophisticated set of calculations and models. And in that case, in theory, you could replicate consciousness. And that's fair. There's a lot of very smart people behind that. But what if the reverse happens? What if we get so good at measuring all of these kind of physical aspects of our brain, but we realize that there is actually something else beyond that, that where we go when we dream, where we go when we feel, where we go when we think, has some of the characteristics of this, but there is something else. Perhaps there is a realm called the imaginal realm that humans can experience that the computers can't. And why this is interesting to me, and there is where we start to tie things back. Here is where we get back into the horror, if the AI isn't horrible enough. A young man named Howard Phillips Lovecraft. You can tell by the tentacles. He obviously was not deeply into computers at all. They mostly didn't exist when he lived. But he also lived in this kind of realm of theories. H.P. Lovecraft, broadly speaking, lived in a world where you had humans as these very small creatures and vast, titanic, ancient forces and realms and things all around them that massively dwarfed the overall capacity of humans to understand them. The canonical ending of a kind of classic Lovecraft story is that the hero, if they can be called a hero, the hero opens the door and gets a tiny glimpse of what lives beyond and then goes instantly insane. This is the kind of classic, this is what he saw. I'm in no way suggesting that H.P. Lovecraft was necessarily right in constructing a vast universe full of giant star priests and ancient creatures, but it's a very strong it's a strong instance and an instantiation of this idea of there's a realm of imagination, there's a realm of things that humans are only part of. It's not just all in our heads. So, if we take a Lovecraftian leap and go a little crazy, as AI develops in its exotic, interesting way, as the models get better, as their capabilities come to augment us in whatever ways that happens, that information realm that gets super developed somehow starts like an octopus to detect and engage with and try to enter this imaginal realm that potentially lies beyond humans that it can't actually reach. And what that might look like for me, well, there's lots of possibilities, but then I think our dreams, our consciousness, the things that human beings interact with gets really interesting and messy and exotic. And that's one possible visualization. These two kind of vast things, like it's essentially the almost sentient information realm reaching and grasping around the dream realm, and the dream realm reaching and grasping back, and these two things just kind of fighting it out in the cosmos above us. It could be a wonderful, colorful, strange, beautiful thing. We could be living pretty soon in a far richer and more emotionally complex and more informationally complex realm. And we could realize that it's actually a bit more Lovecraftian than we think, and that out there at the edges of the imaginal realm, there are in fact giant ancient monsters. My point here, and the reason for drawing these larger metaphors, is this idea that the experiences that we all have as individuals through our lives, the experience of going through strange territory, trying to find our way through episodes of illness, depression, all of those kind of issues, These issues may get a lot bigger and a lot weirder as we expand some of the ideas that we have about what's out there. And this is now where we start to go right on the home stretch. I am eyeing my raspberry marshmallow chocolate thing. So what are we doing in the games industry as game developers, as game creators? On the one hand, we should be, as always, as a business, looking at the opportunities that lie around us to put out entertainment products that generate a good rate of return and can exist in places, for instance, like a $500,000 horror game that turns into a $5 million horror movie. There is always that aspect to it. But I'm significantly more ambitious around this. And one of the reasons that I've thrown a bunch of different kind of angles of attack at you during this is the fundamental thing that we do, I would argue, is that we do create interactive experiences. I mean, that seems so obvious, but man, we forget it sometimes. And beyond that, what is an interactive experience? It is literally you are training and helping someone to navigate a essentially imaginary landscape that is driven by information technology. So I don't think we take seriously enough at all the idea that as we as humans, individually and collectively, as we move into what I suspect are even stranger spaces, as individual people, but as an entire species. I mean, things have gotten weird last 10 years. Yeah, everyone feels it. There is a very real and very, very elevated role for the people who are basically providing the rehearsals for this. What is every game that you've ever played, but in one sense, a rehearsal for you to develop the ability to navigate through essentially unreal spaces? And we can do a lot more of that in a lot of different ways, on a much, much, much more profound level, as, first off, the business realities catch up, but much more importantly, as everyone enters into what could be very interesting territory. So when I think of big metaphors and big things, I do suspect, and this is just my mad conclusion, I suspect there's really horrible stuff out there in some form, perhaps really only in our minds, but perhaps beyond them. But I think the increasing weirdness of the world that we have spotted is perhaps a harbinger of this. I think there is a genuine role for us in this industry to take quite seriously the idea that there is a vast, interesting night sky and a very deep black ocean out there, and we can ultimately be the people in the lifeboat who help our fellow human beings navigate this. So when you talk to me about what is the theme of this conference, what is the evolution of games, I think that's it. I think we can sometimes take a giant leap of our own imaginations, and we can just assert really strongly the evolution of what we do. It really matters. And it is not to say that entertainment and making things that are fun does not matter. It does enormously. But I think we can set very large stages for ourselves, and it matters now, and it's going to matter a great deal more as we proceed through this landscape of invention and horror and imagination and information that is boiling all around us. That is me. I am about to enjoy my first touch of sugar in the last 3 days. Thank you very much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it. Oh my God. It's so raspberry. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it.